Many people who have been in an emotionally abusive relationships have had their version of you do not know how to communicate. The problem is that they spent years believing it. Have you ever been told that you're a bad communicator in a relationship? Not once, not twice, so many times that you started questioning yourself. Maybe you found yourself replaying old conversations in your head at night. Maybe you started learning or reading relationship books. You started watching videos. You started learning conflict resolutions. And then you started, choosing your words carefully. Trying not to sound emotional. Trying not to sound defensive. Trying not to sound needy. Trying not to sound angry, trying to sound perfect. And somehow it was never enough. If this is your story, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the problem isn't that you do not know how to communicate. Sometimes it's that you're trying to communicate with someone who does not have the intention of understanding you. And there's a difference. I remember how many people describe it. You bring up something that really hurts you, not an attack, not a fight, just something simple. Maybe you said, this really hurts me. And then somehow, 30 minutes later, you are defending the fact that you even brought it up. And now you're explaining your tone, your timing, your wording, your reaction, your facial expression. You explain everything except the original issue. The conversation started with their behavior and somehow it ended with your own communication skill. And after enough of these conversations, you start believing them. You start thinking, maybe I really am the problem. You become hyper aware of every word that comes out of your mouth. You rehearse every conversation before having them. You explain yourself in paragraphs. You write text messages and delete them 10 times. You over-explain yourself because you're trying to avoid being misunderstood. But here's what nobody tells you. People who genuinely want to understand you do not require a perfect performance before they listen. Healthy communication is not about saying everything perfectly. It's about both people understanding each other. And this is the part that often gets ignored because in these relationships, the goalposts keep moving. One day you're too emotional, the next day you're too cold. One day you talk too much and the next day you don't communicate enough. One day you're too sensitive and the next day you don't care enough. No matter what you do, the criticism changes because the issue was never your communication. It was never about how you communicate. The issue was control. Think about it. If someone constantly tells you that your communication is wrong, but never take responsibility for how they communicate, what does that tell you? Communication is supposed to be a two-way street, not a performance review where only one person gets criticized. And one of the saddest things that happens is this. People leave this kind of relationship convinced they are difficult, convinced they are bad partners, convinced they are bad communicators. And then they meet healthier people. And then suddenly they are understood. And then suddenly they are not being interrogated for explaining their feelings. Suddenly disagreement don't turn into character assassination. And suddenly they can say, that hurts me. And the other partner says, oh, I'm sorry. Tell me more. No argument, no twisting, no blame shifting, just understanding. And that's when they realize something heartbreaking. They were never asking for too much. They were simply asking the wrong person. If you have been told over and over that you do not know how to communicate, I want to ask you a simple question. When you express your feelings, were they trying to understand you or they were trying to win? Because those are two very different conversations. People who want understanding, they ask questions. People who want control look for weaknesses. People who want connection, they listen. And people who want power look for ways to make you doubt yourself. And when you've lived in that environment for too long, you can lose trust in your own voice. You start second guessing yourself, even things you know are true. That's why so many people come out of these relationships feeling confused. Not because they couldn't communicate, but because they were constantly being told that their realities were wrong. So, if this video feels familiar to you, I want you to stop carrying every failed conversation that went wrong on your shoulders. Not every failed conversation is your responsibility, and not every misunderstanding means you communicated badly. And not every person who criticizes your communication is qualified to judge it. Sometimes you're not being heard because you're unclear, but sometimes you're not being heard because the other person benefits from misunderstanding you. And that's the truth so many people discover too late. And if you're discovering it now, please do not be ashamed, because questioning yourself is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you cared enough to keep trying. The real question is, did they care enough to meet you halfway? If this resonates with you, let me know in the comments. What was the one phrase they kept using that made you question yourself? I'd love to hear your story.